Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor and Deputy Vice-Chancellor, for the kind introduction. I was actually very pleased to be here for the awards to your outstanding educators. I think it's actually very important for universities to publicly acknowledge those who have spent their time and their effort improving learning and teaching and the student experience and student outcomes within their university. So thank you for allowing me to be part of that as well. And it's very nice to see that in a public forum such as today. So today I would like to start a conversation with you around assessment. It's often said that assessment drives learning. What it actually does, though, I think, is drives approaches to learning rather than necessarily the learning itself. And it's something that we need to keep in mind. And really, the conversation that I would encourage you to have within your own institution is really, what type of approach do you want to take to assessment? What things do you value? What message do you want to send to your students about what is important? What is important to you as a university, and what is going to be important to them when they graduate and go out into the workforce? And I want to encourage you to have a conversation around whether you are assessing the things that are important or whether you are simply assessing the things that are easy to assess or the things that you have traditionally assessed. And that is really the summary of today's talk, is really about that, to encourage that conversation. There are many different types of reports that I could put up to show you that employers are not necessarily satisfied with everything that we do within a university with our graduates. It's often said that our graduates have technical skills, but they don't have many of the other skills that are important for life and for work. It's really important that universities think both about the technical skills that our students need to develop, but also their people skills, also their thinking skills, also their emotional intelligence, also their ability to be able to work in the real world, because there are consequences to everything a person does in the real world. And we need to think about how we incorporate that into our assessment tasks. So I've just picked one particular study here. This happened to be for STEM graduates, for science and engineering and maths graduates. But the sorts of things that employers are looking for are these wider aspects of the skills and capabilities for our students. We often say this, and it was mentioned, I think the Vice-Chancellor mentioned graduate capabilities or graduate attributes, and we often have nice lists of graduate attributes and graduate capabilities. Really, one of the things that I think we should be thinking about is, how do we incorporate into those graduate attributes and capabilities the wider range of skills that our students need to be able to develop apart from just their technical skills. So this is just one example. So one of the things that I also like to talk a little bit about is the context. So when we think of graduate attributes, graduate skills, no doubt you have lists of learning outcomes for all of your programs, and probably goes down to your courses as well. And I must say, in my university, we often end up with a very formulaic approach to doing this. We basically have templates, we have lists, we tick those lists off, and then everyone's quite happy if we're able to tick those lists off. But I must say, those lists do not often generate a meaningful conversation amongst the academic staff and the students about what it is that's important and what it is that we need to be assessing and what it is we need to be putting into our learning designs. This particular example I've put up here is not a list of graduate attributes, but was from from work that was done within the University of Melbourne about what are the things that are important, what are the things that we should be assessing. And the reason I particularly like this list is that it is a short list for a start. I can usually only remember 3 or 4 things at a time in my head. And I have to be honest with you and say, if you ask me now to recite the University of New South Wales graduate attributes, I probably actually couldn't do that. I'd probably have to go to our website and see what it says on our website. And to me, that actually tells me it tells me 2 things. One, that perhaps I'm not very good at remembering these things. But the other it really tells me is that those lists are not something that sits in my mind all the time when I'm thinking about the next thing I'm going to do with my students or with the academic staff at UNSW. Something like this that I've put up, I think, is much simpler. It's actually a much better conversation starting point, and it's something that you can have in your mind the whole time when you're thinking about learning design, when you're thinking about assessment tasks, when you're thinking about the things that you want your students to be able to do, when you think about the things that are going to be important. So what is it that we really want to assess in our students? We actually do want to assess the ways in which they think. Now, if you reflect on your assessment tasks that you set for your students, how do you know what the student is thinking when they are responding to your assessment task? We often use the artifact or the product of what a student does during that assessment task to work backwards to imply what they were probably thinking at the time that they gave you the response. So a lot of that is around implication rather than actual facts about what we know students were actually thinking. So if we can say ways of thinking, ways of working, the tools that we use for working, and then the consequences of working in the real world or living in the real world, those four things we should be asking ourselves every single time we design a learning activity or we design an assessment task for our students. Are we actually assessing the way in which the student is thinking, and how do we know that? Are we assessing the way in which they go about doing their work? That is, I'm not talking about work as in a job, I'm talking about work as in the working mind, as in what was going on in their head when they were giving you a response. How did they communicate their level of understanding? How did they communicate with other people during the assessment task? And I'm going to come back to that later on when I talk about different types of assessment tasks and how we might want to incorporate the collaboration and the teamwork aspects into our assessment tasks. But I encourage you to think about these four things and say, how do you actually incorporate those into your assessment tasks with your students? And we'll come back to those in various ways. I'm actually a very visual learner myself, so I actually like images and diagrams rather than words. And these two images that I've got up here pretty much describe a lot of what I see in curriculum design in my own institution. I see curriculum design that actually tethers the student to time and place. What I think we need to be able to do is to break that chain and say, why is a 2-hour exam or a 3-hour exam at the end of a semester the most effective, important and efficient way to assess what a student has actually learnt? I often say to my colleagues, why does it take 2 hours or 3 hours to tell me what you know or what the student knows and what they think? What's magic about 2 hours or 3 hours? In the real world, there are only some tasks that we have to complete within 2 hours or 3 hours. And I must say, in the real world, there's almost no task that you have to complete in 2 or 3 hours with paper and pen, sitting at a desk, not talking to anyone, not being allowed to access any resources, and just have to sit there and be quiet and do your responses. There's very few real-life problems that actually get solved that way. So if we're looking at the alignment between the assessment tasks that we're giving our students and the relationship between that and what they're going to be expected to do in the real world, often there is very little alignment between those two things. So I would encourage you again to think about why. Why does your assessment task have to be done within 2 hours or 3 hours? Why does it have to be done with pen and paper if that's what your predominant form of assessment is? And that's, in my university, it's still the most predominant form of assessment that we have. And why are you denying students access to resources to actually help them be able to solve that problem when they actually might be able to give you a more imaginative solution to the problem? And I'm going to come back, I'll talk a bit about the types of questions and types of tasks that we ask students to do later. Why have I got someone in a box? I've got someone in a box because, to me, this describes what we do around curriculum design. What we do is we actually limit the types of things, the types of thinking that we want our students to do, because we give them often these lists of graduate attributes, these learning outcomes, and we say, here's the list of things that you have to do. So a student will automatically think, well, that's all I have to do. I just have to do what's on the list. I only have to do what's inside the box. What I think we should be doing is providing assessment tasks and learning environments for students that open the box and actually encourage students to explore the world around them rather than the one just inside the box. So we'll come back to that when I talk about different types of assessment tasks. So I did say to you the summary pretty much of this presentation is let's teach and assess what is important to teach and assess and not what is easy to teach and assess. So if you take away nothing else from today, that's the conversation starter for you to talk to your colleagues about and whether you're actually doing that. And this is really just a longer version of the same thing I said on the previous slide. This is really just saying, let's rethink how we actually design our learning activities, how we design our assessment tasks, so that we still cover those discipline, the important discipline skills and knowledge and capabilities that our students have to have. As you heard, my background's chemistry. So when I used to teach in chemistry, I mean, students still had to know something about chemistry. They still had to know something about the periodic table. They still had to know something about how reactions occur and why and those sorts of things. So you still have to know some of those sorts of things. However, if that was all I ever did with my students, that would be very limiting in terms of their ability to be able to make a difference in the world. Because all I would do is just reproduce what was already known. So one of the things I'll encourage you to think about in your assessment tasks is do you cover off the things that they have to know and have to be able to do, but then do you expand what they're able to do by giving them some more imaginative tasks, by getting them outside that box, by actually breaking that tether to the time and place and actually allowing them to explore the wider world and the consequences. So they take their discipline, knowledge and understanding and apply it in a wider context. And I'll come back to this bit about collaboration and working with other people, because I think it is one of the key things that we need to do with our students is actually facilitate them to be able to work with a wide variety of tools and a wide variety of people. And then we need to incorporate that into the assessment task. Now, if I do this in my own university and talk about these sorts of things, and especially when you see the next few slides about some of the options that we might have available to us, this is normally the reaction I get. So this is one of our typical academic staff at UNSW. When I start talking about changing assessment, changing the way we teach, changing the way we learn, it's normally the reaction that you get. And the reason we get this reaction, of course, is that we all get very comfortable with the way that we do things. So we also don't want to scare our colleagues into thinking that we're a little bit different or we're on the fringe, or that we no longer fit in with all of our other colleagues. I've often been surprised how much peer pressure there is in universities not to change and not to do things differently. And that's because we value the opinion of our colleagues. And if our colleagues are very traditional in the way in which they do things, then we try and slot into that very traditional mould and that model that we have so that we fit in. So one of the things I will talk about today is contestable and non-contestable knowledge and understanding. But I think that actually applies to academics as well, and that I would encourage you to think about contesting some of the ways in which you currently do things and to question why. Why are you doing things the way you do at the moment? Is this really the way it should be? Or should we be able to do these things differently? So again, a bit about metaphor and images here. I actually quite love this image here because this again reminds me of assessment in most universities, that this is how it is. We line the students up and we say, right, tick off the things. Do you know this? Do you know that? Yes, you do. Right, bang, give them a stamp and off they go. And then we do that for often for our students. What we need to be able to do is to think about moving beyond just correct or incorrect or right or wrong in terms of the responses that students get. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about contestable and non-contestable knowledge and understanding. Most things in real life are complex. Most things in real life do not have a right or a wrong answer. What they have is consequences to the solutions that are provided. So one of the things that we should be doing with our students is moving them from where they think everything is either black or white in terms of their reaction, in terms of their responses, this or that, it's one or the other. Sometimes we say to them it's either correct or incorrect. What we need to be able to think is more broadly than that and say to students, provide a solution and then provide a justification for that solution. And the justification is not just the discipline knowledge or skills, but the wider context of the solution that you've just provided to a problem. Often when we talk about flexible or online learning and teaching and assessment in particular, I often get from my colleagues the question, well, surely if you allow students to do things online, or you give them all this flexibility, or you don't sit them down, by themselves with pen and paper and not allowed to talk to anyone, surely if we gave them the internet and we gave them an assessment, all they'd do is Google the answer. And I suppose my main response to my colleagues for that is, yes, that's if you ask them a question where they can Google the answer, that's exactly what the students will do, because you are actually setting them up or you are actually asking them essentially to do that if you give them that type of question. So my premise here is, if you can Google the answer to your question, to your assessment task, why are you asking the question in the first place? Is that actually the best question that you should be asking the students if the answer is available on the internet or on Google? What we should be thinking about is giving them a more complex question or a more sophisticated question, so that they can't just Google the answer, because the answer is actually more complex than just a simple response. It's actually looking at the wider context for that answer that they're going to give, or the response that they're going to give. So I'll come back to that when we talk about the different types of assessment. So what are the different types of assessment tasks that we could be using? This I've just put up, not because this is a comprehensive list, but this is really just to show you the wide range of assessment tasks that are available to us that we could be using with our students. A few years ago, I was involved with a project across a number of universities in Australia where we mapped out the discipline task types in different universities. And what we did is we just asked academics in different disciplines, what task type do you use in your assessment? And what was really interesting when we did that, first of all, was to see how few task types were used across a program, across a whole degree. Normally, most degrees would use something like 3, 4, or at the most 5 different types of tasks across an entire degree. So when a student was doing a 3 or 4 or 5 year degree, they would only have 3 or 4 or at most 5 different types of things that they were asked to do. Usually that means we are limiting the type of question and the type of task that we are giving students. So one of the interesting exercises is to say, well, why can't you use a wider variety of task types in your discipline? Now, I know when I say this when I used to say this to my chemistry colleagues when I was in chemistry, they would always, say to me, well, we're hardly going to do, let me pick one here, we're hardly going to do a dance performance to describe the periodic table with our students. We're not going to ask them that sort of question. And yes, I guess that's an obvious sort of example that you could use, although I do question that and say, actually, it'd be lovely to see an interpretive dance of the periodic table and see what that actually might look like, because that would actually tell me that a student was very imaginative and actually was able to broaden the context in which they were operating. But let's leave that one aside and say we should be able to expand the type of tasks that we're asking students by being aware of a much richer variety of things that we could be asking our students to do. And I'm going to go through just a couple of those and things that you might like to think about as we go through. The other thing I'm going to talk about when I get onto the examples is a little bit about game-based learning and game-based assessment. And this is something that we've been exploring a little bit at my university. What's interesting about this is as soon as I mention to academics about game-based learning or game-based assessment, they assume that we're converting everything into a computer game where you go around sort of shooting things or finding things and putting them in boxes or something like that. That's usually, that's the common conception of game-based learning, especially when you use technology. There's two things to say about that. One is not every game is done on a computer. There are lots of different ways in which you can apply game-based learning to actually physical activities that students can do. But the other, of course, is that it's not converting all of our learning or assessment into a game necessarily. But what it is it's using game-based theory. There's actually quite a lot of literature around games and why in particular online games, but why they actually work. And we've done a little bit of work of mapping game-based theory onto learning and assessment theory. And what's really interesting there is that a learning and assessment activity is actually just like a well-designed game. In a well-designed game, what you have is you have activities that you have to do, you have feedback on those activities, the participant in that game incorporates that feedback into the next activity that they do in the game. Games also have levels, just like we do in assessment. The big difference, though, is a well-designed game is all about engagement and about persistence and about standards and levels and achievement. Now, all those words I just used there are exactly the same words that we apply with learning and with assessment. So a well-designed learning and assessment activity is really just like a game. What the difference is, though, that we organise our learning around time and space restrictions. So basically we say to students, sit in a room such as this often, and we say, listen to someone talk, like you are now, and we say to them, right, you do that, and you might do that 3 or 4 or 5 times a week, you know, for a particular area. We then say to them, right, in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 weeks or something, we'll give you an assessment task. And then if you're lucky, you might get some feedback on that, either a week or 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or sometimes never, after you've done the assessment task. It's actually extremely rare that when you give feedback to a student on their assessment task, that they actually use that feedback in the next task or the next learning activity that you get them to do. So why am I talking about games? Because I think we've got a lot to learn from the way games work. In a game, especially a computer game, you do an action, you get immediate feedback on that, you assimilate that feedback into the immediate next activity that you do. You then earn points in the game, and that's equivalent to earning grades or marks in your assessment, and then you accumulate those to go to a different level in the game. When you go in a game, when you go to the different level, you are expected to be more sophisticated in terms of the activities that you do. That's exactly the same that we would expect in someone in learning and assessment. So again, I encourage you to think a little bit about how you could use the theory of games to apply to your learning and assessment activities, and how you can shorten the time between the feedback that you give students and the next learning activity that they do and the next assessment activity that they do. So I'm just going to show just a really brief outline here of one of the ones that we've been involved in at my university. Let me just bring this one up for you. Now, why did I show that particular one? I showed that particular one because we've developed a series of games for a number of our courses and programs at UNSW. We have Playconomics for first-year economics, we have Play Tax, we have Play Med, and we have Play Energy. So it's across a number of different areas. These are learning and assessment activities, and probably Playconomics is the one that's gone the most in this direction. In first-year economics now, which is actually our largest first-year class at University of New South Wales. We have about 2,000 students in first-year economics. They have replaced the entire first semester, no lectures. The students just play the game for the whole semester, and incorporated into that game is all of the learning, all of the assessment, and all of the feedback that they need for the entire semester. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that we convert every single course into a game, because actually students have told us that they would get a bit tired of that if that was every single one of their courses, that they just had to play the game. But the reason we did this was, first of all, to monitor students and to see, did they, sorry, I must say that the final exam, the first time this was done, the final exam was exactly the same. They just did a traditional paper-based exam at the end of the first semester after students had already played the game, and see what the performance of those students was. and they actually showed that there was at least a 10% increase in the average mark of the students when they played the game compared to previous cohorts of the students. And that was directly related to the feedback that was actually given and the timeliness of the feedback that was then incorporated into the next activity. So it does actually, it has been shown to make a significant difference to the learning of the students. However, we would not do this for every single course, but if you do this for some of your courses, first of all, it gives the students variety, so that's the first thing. And I must say, for our first-year economics students, economics can be quite dry sometimes for some of our students. And the feedback we got from them was this has taken a really dry subject and actually converted into something which is much more engaging. So that was one thing that I just wanted to show you there with that particular one. We're developing, so that was quite a sophisticated game, that one. And yes, it does cost quite a lot of money to design and develop those sorts of games. And the reason that was applied to, say, first-year economics was because of the large classes that we had there. It made economic sense to be able to spend the money to develop that sort of game, because it actually replaced a large number of the tutorials that the students did, so the school didn't have to employ tutors for all of those tutorials that they traditionally ran. So it made sense to be able to do that. That doesn't apply to all of the games that we've done, but it does apply to that. So this one I'm showing here, our Ludo, is another, sorry, I should have mentioned, Lion's Heart is a company that was set up by two of our academics. So our university is actually quite entrepreneurial, and many of our students and many of our staff spin off companies from the work that they do at the university. So Lion's Heart is one of those. Ludo is another one. This is a science academic who has set up our Ludo, and this one is entirely different. This is not about necessarily summative assessment or replacing lectures. This is about games that students can play on their phones during class. So this is not meant to replace face-to-face classes. This is to design the learning activities and the formative assessment tasks and feedback for students inside the formal classroom. So I just want to, I'm not going to show you this one, it was really just to show you that there are different types of activities that you can do. So my university also has a partnership with Arizona State University and King's College London, where we do joint research and where we do joint course exchange with them. And one of the things that we're involved in with Arizona State University is some of the online simulations that they do. And one of those is called HabWorlds, which is about an environment for where students have to take an environment and convert it into a habitable environment. So it's about exploring different planets, and it's about bringing together all of their discipline-based knowledge to apply to a problem. And again, because of time, I won't show you the video for that one, but it's worth, the reason I'm giving you this and the URLs on here is so that you can go and explore these yourself if you're interested in terms of the activities that they do here. The one that I will talk about, though, is the remote field trips. So again, this is one of the ones that we're involved with Arizona State University. So we've done some work, and they've done work as well, about these immersive virtual field trips. So this again is a learning and an assessment activity that we do with our students, where we can't physically take our students to all the remote locations in Australia or in Arizona or anywhere else. But what we can do is we can give them a three-dimensional immersive environment that they can do on screen and explore those different environments. So we've incorporated those. The reason I put this up here is to give you the range of types of virtual field trips that have already been developed and are available to students at our two universities. And I just wanted to show you this one, which is an example of how you can incorporate both learning and assessment into the same type of activity. So this one the students can explore as a learning activity, and this is about geology remote field trips here, and just to show how you can incorporate information in there. But just as that's bringing up the information that we have there, you could actually run this whole thing as an assessment task as well, because all of those little pop-ups can be questions that you ask students, and then you can get the students to actually put in responses to those questions. Not only can you get the students to put in a response, but you can get them, you can ask the students to actually explain what they're seeing or what they think they're seeing, and then why they think that is important. So earlier I said to you about ways of thinking. So this is one of the ways in which you can capture what students are thinking during the assessment task. Now, I know you can do this on pen and paper as well, but what this allows students to do is to explore a much richer environment so that you can ask them different types of questions. Because basically you could do a version of this on pen and paper, but the problem with that is that every student would get exactly say you put an image and then you ask students a question about the image, which is what we traditionally do in pen and paper types of assessments. The issue there is every student gets the same image, which means that you're pretty much expecting the same type of response from every student. One of the things, and I think it's on a slide coming up, I'll be talking about the two concepts of convergent and divergent responses from students. A convergent response is where we expect all students in the class to give us the same response. A divergent response is where we expect them to give us different responses. So the reason that something like this would be useful in an assessment task is it would encourage students to give you a more divergent response rather than a convergent one. And I think this is one of the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of our assessment tasks. And again, one of the conversation pieces for you is to think about whether your tasks are convergent or whether they're divergent and why. So are you expecting every student in the class to give you the same response? Or are you expecting to give you a different response and then justify that response? Because your role as the assessor is going to be quite different when you ask those two different types of responses. So just as we do remote field trips, there's also remote labs. Now, most universities can't afford to have all of the equipment that they would like for their students. So what most universities do is they either share equipment or they just limit the students' activities to the equipment that they have. One of the things that you have available to you are these virtual labs. From a student's point of view, when they're using a virtual lab, it actually doesn't matter where it physically sits. It could be sitting anywhere in the world. So it could quite frankly be in the room next door, but then it could be in any country around the world as well. And this is actually a great opportunity for universities to be able to share their resources as well by setting up these remote labs. So there's actually a couple of consortia that are set up where people do share the laboratory experiments they have. And obviously these types of experiments have to be suitable for being put online and being accessed through the internet. The example that I just showed there, or you've been watching, is really a motor. And then the student can actually manipulate the motor, so they can actually change the parameters. So they can change things like voltage, they can change current, they can change the size of different components that they have. And then what they can do is they can get live measurements from that. So why am I showing you this? Well, first of all, this is an example that would actually expand the types of activities that you could get your students to do. You could do this as a learning activity, but you can also equally well do it as an assessment activity. The advantage of doing this as an assessment activity is that you can give students different starting parameters so that not every student gets the same starting point. What's the advantage of that? Often in online assessment or digital assessment, we often ask a question where every student gets the same question and the same parameters around that question. So obviously one of the things that we can do in the online environment is to put variables in there. And those variables mean that different students will have to give you different responses because they all have a different starting point. And again, just in terms of thinking about your assessment task, do you want your students to have the same starting point so that they all end up at the same end point? Or do you want to give your students different starting points so that they can take a different journey through the content and through the discipline understanding and skills and end up at different finishing points? And I'll come back to that when I talk about scenario-based learning and role plays as well, because they're quite good for doing that. But here's a simple example, the example I've got here about remote labs, of where you can give students different starting points, but the concept is the same. So this is really about getting students to explore the concept. And by giving students different starting points, you can ensure more adequately that they understand the concept, because they have to actually show you that they understand how to apply that concept to their particular starting point. So again, this is an alternative to giving students sort of calculation, simply formulaic calculation questions to ask. You can ask more conceptual questions here rather than just calculation questions. And I'll show you that again when we talk about some of the chemistry ones, the chemistry examples that I've got. So, students, we hear a lot about personalisation, and we hear a lot about personalised learning. What I have not heard as much about is personalised assessment. That is actually giving students, as I said, these different starting points for their assessment tasks, which are all based on the same concept, but allow students to take that concept in different directions depending on their level of understanding. And to relate this back to that slide I had at the beginning about ways of thinking, ways of working, the tools for working and living in the real world, those things can be explored more deeply when you actually allow students to be able to have a personalised assessment task, because then they can actually show you their deep level of understanding or not of a particular concept. If we give students the same starting point and we give them convergent or questions that require a convergent response, then we do not allow students to be able to show us the depth of their understanding. We actually deliberately limit the type of response they're going to be able to give us to those questions. And I was actually struck when I was listening to the Vice-Chancellor talk about flexibility as well. I would have to say, having worked in the area of flexible learning or online learning for quite a while, I think one of our biggest impediments is actually not the technology. So becoming flexible is actually not about the technology and the flexibility that that might afford. The flexibility is actually in one's mind. And so what we need is actually flexible ways of thinking ourselves. We need to be more flexible in the way in which we design and deliver the learning activities and the assessment tasks for our students. So again, I would encourage you to have conversations about how flexible are you in terms of the design and the delivery of your learning activities and your assessment tasks. And do not limit your flexibility to the technology. The flexibility is actually around the design aspects of your tasks that you give students. We also have to put a bit of reality into this as well. So it's all very nice, my talking about all these wonderful games and all these flexible ways of doing things. But as was mentioned earlier, every university has things like accreditation. We all have benchmarking. We all have people looking over our shoulder to say, are we doing a good job or not a good job? And people are asking for the evidence to know whether we're doing a good job or not with our graduates. So we do have to have ways of being able to show the outcomes, but those outcomes do not have to be restricted outcomes. What we need to be able to think about is justifying the fact that if you want your students to be more flexible in the way they think, to be more flexible in the way they approach life and their careers and their work, then we need to be able to justify that in ways that still show the rigour, so the academic rigour still needs to be present in the work that we do. So I'm certainly not saying that we need to diminish that. That absolutely needs to be incorporated and included in everything that we do. However, we do have to have solutions that are sustainable. And when I mentioned those games early on, the starting point, as I said to you, was in our big first-year classes, because it made economic sense to be able to spend the money to develop those games in that particular environment. If we had had only 20 students in those classes, then it would not have been worth spending the amount of money we did in developing those games. So we do have to think about the realities of the finance and the sustainability of what we do. I put down the word intelligent risk because I think if universities do nothing else, universities should be places where risk is taken, but it's actually intelligent risk. Universities are here to contest the status quo. They are here to say, why do we do things the way we currently do them? Is this the best we can do? So we certainly want to encourage not only our staff, but also our students to start contesting the way in which we do things. But that is actually framed around intelligent risk, and that is actually what universities are all about. And I think we heard earlier about data as well. And I'm not going to talk much about data or data analytics, but certainly we need to incorporate evidence that what we're doing is actually effective, and that's actually an important part of it. So now I want to talk about two probably of my favourite topics in assessment, and that is how do we actually start moving from this convergent approach, or everyone giving us the same response, moving towards more the divergent approach that we have, where we want students to give us different responses. One of the ways that we can do that is to broaden the types of tasks that we ask students to do. So there's two examples that I'd like to give you. One is around scenario-based learning and the other is around role plays. I'm quite a big fan of both of these because they offer students opportunities to be able to take different directions in the solutions to the problems that we're giving them. This first one, and as I'm talking I'll just play the little video here and you can see what this looks like. So in scenario-based learning, this is about setting up a scenario for students and actually deliberately incorporating decision points in that scenario. And this is actually where the assessment comes in, because we can actually assess those decision points for our students. And this gets back to that first thing I talked about with ways of thinking and ways of working and living in the real world and the tools that we use. So here, this type of activity is incorporating all of those four things into this particular learning and assessment activity. This scenario gives a starting point, so the students do actually all start at the same starting point. But then we deliberately put branch points into this scenario, and those branch points are actually based around key concepts. So what I'm really doing here is talking about a design of a learning and an assessment activity. It can be both learning and assessment in the same activity. And we can use those branch points or the decision points as the assessment points for the students. So a student gets to a particular point in the scenario, they then are given a series of options. Do you want to go down path A, B, C, or D? So a student has to make a choice. They then are asked to justify their choice. So in this particular application that we've got here, the student actually has to not only make the choice, but they have to type in why they've chosen that particular path. So what is it? What was their thinking to go down to the next level or the next step in this particular path? The other thing I like about scenario-based learning, in particular the way this one is set up, is that students can access or use different bits of information. And one of the nice things about this particular scenario-based learning activity is that when it's set up as an assessment task, the students can actually buy information. So what do I mean by buy information? These types of scenarios are often set up where students will be given the option to be able, they're either given an amount of money to start with, like imaginary money, and then they're allowed to use that money to buy different pieces of information. If they run out of money, they then can't access any more information. They just have to solve the problem by themselves. So you might say, why? Why would you do that for students? One of the things that employers would like to know is how efficient and effective is someone at problem solving. By efficient and effective, what we mean is how long do they take to solve the problem, and how many bits of information do they need before they can actually propose a solution to that problem. So this scenario is actually getting students to think about how much information do I need to know to be able to solve this problem. Do I already know the information, or do I need to buy that information to satisfy myself that I do understand what I'm doing? The other way this scenario can be set up is with time. And that is, students are given a specific amount of time to be able to complete the task. Again, why is that important? I said to you early on, why do we do two-hour exams or 3-hour exams? Why is that such a magical thing? Well, in some disciplines, time is important. One of the scenarios that I've seen set up in this particular format is for veterinary science students. And the scenario is that a person walks in with their sick dog to the veterinary clinic, and the student has 1 hour to solve the problem because the dog's going to die in 1 hour if they can't solve the problem. And so this is actually to set up a real-life scenario for students where time is important. You can imagine this sort of scenario as well for our nursing students or our health science or our medical students as well. Someone walks into an emergency room the patient will die within 1 hour or 2 hours or something like that if you can't solve the problem. So this is where time is important. And this is where you can set up the real-life scenario, because this actually runs in real time. So one of the nice things that I actually saw with the vet scenario was that they actually talked to the students about this afterwards, after they'd done this scenario. And one of the most common bits of feedback from the students was the emotional response they had when the dog died because they couldn't solve the problem with 1 hour. Now, this is just a game. This is not real, right? But it actually evokes a real response, an emotional response from the participants, because they want to save the dog. Now, that's a simple example there, but you can imagine how you could apply that to many different scenarios. It also brings in the emotional side of actually being able to solve problems. And I think this is actually important, because students have to realise that there are consequences to what they do. Often this is not just a theoretical exercise. This actually impacts on real people. And we need to start getting our students to be able to engage with the emotional side of the solutions that they're going to have to be providing for real people. So that was just one example. So in terms of things to think about, there are different types of assessments that we can give our students, and those different types of assessment tasks have different purposes. So I've just put down 4 here. There's lots of different labels. You don't have to use these particular labels up here. People use different labels, but basically there are 4 different types of assessment tasks that we can set for students. We can set tasks before they do their current learning with us, and that's often called a diagnostic. It's probably in universities the most underutilised form of assessment. We often do not give our students, when they first come into a class with us, we don't usually give them a diagnostic to say, well, what actually do you know when you come into this class? What's the baseline for everyone in the class? Do you understand the key concepts that I'm going to be talking about in this class? If this is a second-year class, do you remember the things that you did in first year that are going to be important for what we're doing? So it's actually one of the simplest things that you can do with your students, is actually set up a series of diagnostics for them. It serves a couple of purposes. The first purpose is it gets students to engage with some of the key concepts that they're going to have to deal with. It also means that the student knows that you actually care where they're going to start from in your class. Right? It actually sets up a relationship with the students, because this is not going to affect their marks, right, in their current course. But what it is telling the students that it's important that you want to know what they already know and what they already understand, because you're going to be building on that. So what better way of you being able to do that than to give them some diagnostics so that you understand and the student understands their current level of knowledge and skills and understanding for their current learning. The two that I'm sure all of you are familiar with is what's traditionally called formative and summative assessment. So formative is obviously during the learning process, and that's supposed to inform learning. It's supposed to inform the next activity. I've talked a little bit about that with the game-based learning. And again, what I would encourage you to do is to have conversations with your colleagues about why you actually set up formative tasks for students. Often when I talk to my colleagues at UNSW about formative assessment, what they say is the formative assessment is for the student to know whether how they're going. And that's true, it is, and it's supposed to inform the next learning activity that they do. But formative assessment is actually really useful for the teacher as well. Because if you are teaching a class, you want to know whether the majority of the class are up to roughly the same level in terms of their understanding of the work that they're doing. And so one of the ways that you can do that is to set formative tasks to not only help the individual student, but to help you as the teacher to know. Again, when I've talked to my colleagues about this, one of the most powerful things that you can do as a teacher is, first of all, let students know that you care and understand where they are and what they're doing and where their current level of understanding is, but also that you'll do something about it to help them be able to move on to that next step. And so formative assessment is actually a fairly straightforward and easy way for you to be able to do that and to be able to show the students that you actually care about them as well. So formative assessment is not just for the student, it's actually for the teacher as well. Summative, I guess we're all familiar with. The last one that I've put on there, and look, this is basically a term I coined here. There's different names for this as well. But the first three that I've got there, diagnostic, formative and summative, is really about current learning. So this is the learning that students are currently doing. What about the learning they need to do for future activities that they're going to be doing? How does a student know what their approach to their own learning is? How do they get to know what their approach to assessment is? It's interesting with assessment because when you set an assessment task for students, you are automatically advantaging some students and disadvantaging others by the task type that you pick. So if you pick an essay as your assessment format, you are privileging those students who obviously are, do well at writing essays. If you ask students to do a presentation, then you're privileging those that can stand up in front of a group and do a good presentation. If you set up multiple choice questions, for students, you're advantaging students who do well in that sort of recall type of environment. So one of the things you need to think about when you set up your assessment task types is which students in your class are you advantaging, which are you disadvantaging, and do you have a variety of task types so that you actually spread the task types amongst the different preferences for your students. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk a little bit about negotiated assessment, because that's one of the really interesting things that we've just started doing at my university, and we actually started at my previous university. So I just want to encourage you to think about the different types of tasks that you get students to do, and whether it's for current learning or whether it's actually to help them with their future learning. So the future learning is really more around the sort of metacognitive approach. So how do students understand their own ability, and how do they understand their own approach to actual problem solving? Because that's going to set up their next task. And that's just the summary in words about what I've just said. One of the other things about about assessment is that students use assessment to decide what you think is important. So the task type and the weighting and the reward mechanism that you put against that assessment task actually sends a very strong message to the students around what you value, because students are going to value what you value. So if you give them tasks that are what I've been describing as convergent, that is, every student in the room gives the same response, then that will encourage them to know or to think that what you are privileging and what you want from them is everyone saying the same thing. That what you're not looking for is divergence. You're not looking for differences of opinion or differences in solutions or different ways of doing things. So think about that when you set those tasks for your students. The other thing is whether you are actually rewarding current learning or future learning. So are you setting up the task so that students can analyse their approaches to learning, a bit like what I said in that scenario-based learning, when I said about giving them branch points and decision points and then getting them to describe what they were thinking and why they made that particular decision. That type of thing is related to this integrative assessment approach, where you get students to analyse their actual approach to problem solving and be able to justify, because then your feedback to them is not around the content, it's actually around the approach. Was this an efficient and effective approach to the solution to the problem? And that's where the feedback is important for the student to know whether that's actually going to be a productive approach to that particular problem. So I've used this word quite a bit, the convergent and divergent. So here's just the formal part and the formal definition for that. But it's actually quite a powerful way for you to think about your assessment tasks. And it's actually a conversation you should have with your students around whether you are privileging and rewarding convergent or divergent responses from the student. Because your role as the assessor is quite different, whether you are expecting a convergent or a divergent response. Convergent responses are often being associated with traditional online assessment. Yeah, because it's easy to write an algorithm for a piece of software that says, if I see this response, then it's correct and I'll give that the marks or reward it. If I see anything else, doesn't matter what it is, if I see anything else that's not that, then I'm going to, yeah, the computer says no, right? The computer says no, that's not right. So one of the things we've been trying to do, and what I've been talking a little bit about in those examples I've shown you up to now, is how would we move from giving more convergent, traditionally having more convergent, to having more divergent assessment. And if you were going to do that in the online environment, what would it look like? So one of the ways is to do that scenario-based learning. The other is to do the role plays, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. But there are some simpler examples that you can use as well. They don't have to be as sophisticated as that, to actually get students to be able to give you divergent rather than convergent responses. This is one example from my own discipline of chemistry. So these are some examples we worked on a couple of years ago. So I've deliberately put this in the format of a traditional learning management system here. So it doesn't matter which learning management system you use, you can have questions that look pretty much like this. And what we've done here, and I'll just play the little video here. So this is a question in a typical learning management system. This happens to be around the periodic table here. The idea here in this question, though, is to give the students access to the periodic table and to give them access to all the information about all the elements on the periodic table. So why would we do that? Because we don't expect students, and we should not expect students, to memorise the periodic table, nor memorise all of the physical properties of the elements on the periodic table. If we give them access, and this is about the tools for working, if we give them access to those tools in the middle of the assessment, we can change the type of question that we ask the students. We don't have to ask them factual questions anymore. We can now start asking them conceptual questions. We can ask them to compare and contrast. We can ask them scenarios. We can say, what happens if you do this? What happens if you do that? So it's using a very familiar format, but actually changing the type of question that you ask students. Here's another example I've used from my own area, again from chemistry. The traditional way we would have asked these sorts of questions is to give every student the same chemical structure and then ask them a convergent question about that structure. That means we're expecting everyone in the class to give the same response. If you give students access to the tools in the middle of the assessment, we can now say to students, instead of giving every student the same type of question, we can say to the students, design me a molecule that has the following properties. What that means is the student can explore in the assessment the different types of physical or biological or chemical properties or whatever it is that we want to do, and different students will give us a different response. And the role of the assessor then is to see whether those responses are aligned to the key concepts that we were doing. So it changes the type of question that you're going to ask. I talked about role plays. I'm coming towards the end now. So I talked about role plays a bit. With role plays, why are role plays different from scenario-based learning? So role plays are like scenarios, but the students can take them in different directions. The reason I like role plays is this allows students to explore the context of what they're doing. So you set a scenario for students, but instead of giving them prescribed pathways, you allow the students to develop those pathways as part of the role play. The other advantage of a role play for a learning or an assessment activity is that the student doesn't have to be themselves. You can give them a persona. So what that means is you can bring out all of the cultural, social, political issues that are associated with different cultures, with different peoples, and say, what does that look like, or what do you think that looks like in this particular scenario? So some of the ones that we've used at my current institution and my previous ones will be things like in the health science area, we've got our students to be members of different cultural groups. And so we might have someone who is assigned at being a female Muslim, someone else being a male Muslim, someone else being a Christian, someone else being a agnostic or something like that, or an atheist, and then saying, how do you think these people would respond in these particular scenarios? Why is that important? It's important that we put ourselves in the shoes of other people and think about the world through a different lens. These are the sorts of things that we should be doing in the university because it's important. It's important for when students go out into the real world because the solutions that they propose to problems have to play out in different social, cultural, economic and political situations. So we should be encouraging our students in a safe environment as in the university, to explore those types of things, because this is what's going to happen to them when they go out into the real world, and something like a role play will allow them to do that. This is probably the last one that I want to show you, which actually combines most of the things that I've just talked about, and I'll play that through this one. This is a game. This is a commercial game, which combines most of those things that I've just described.
From the makers of Operation Ibiza and Pool Paradise comes Shark World, an online adventure in which you're in charge of a team of experts creating the largest shark aquarium in the world, called Shark World. In the hectic urban jungle of Shanghai, you'll work for Spectre Install, a large multinational company responsible for the realization of Shark World. You have to manage and organize a complicated project, solve mysteries and conflicts, motivate your team, and communicate with all kinds of people. Sometimes behind your desktop, sometimes somewhere unexpected. The game continues 24/7 and penetrates your daily life. So you have to be committed and prepared.
So the reason I showed you that one is that's actually a game that runs in real time. And what happens is when a student goes to sleep at night, the game continues. So when they get up in the morning, actually everything's changed, because people around the rest of the world, students around the rest of the world who are playing the game, have changed all of the parameters and changed the activities, and it's moved on. Again, this type of environment that we create for our students is actually to get them to think about the consequences of working in the real world. So just to leave you with the final message here, let's teach and assess what is important and not what is easy to teach and assess. So, Whanaka.